I apologise for my lack of Dutch. When you make a living writing history, you soon realise that what you're trying to do is fundamentally in opposition to what publishers want you to do. What publishers want you to do is to deliver them a novel that happens to be true. They want you to deliver something which is has a perfect arc of beginning, middle and end. It's got heroes, it's got villains, it doesn't have any nasty bits in the middle where you don't really know what's going on. And as a historian, therefore, I spend most of my life dealing with the essential lumpiness of history. The problem that I have is that usually there are great gaps in the story that I try to tell, or areas that are simply pretty boring. Even when I wrote recently about the history of the American mafia, I realised that life as a mafioso is pretty much like life as a soldier. It's 90% sheer boredom and 2% sheer terror. The story of the Batavia is the only one I've ever written which is not like that. The story of the Batavia is the only one I've written which is actually like a novel and needs the minimum of historians' skill to turn it into an amazing story. And for that reason, the story has always had a bit of a special place in my heart. And I'm very pleased, therefore, to be here today as a result. Most of all, of course, it's a story which really does have heroes and villains. And the villain of the Batavia story, Hieronymus Cornelius, really is one of the most villainous characters you could ever possibly hope to meet. But the whole story of the Batavia is as extraordinary as the story of Hieronymus himself. And I learned a little bit about that the first time I came here back in 2000, soon after the ship was completed. And I came here as part of the research for the book. And actually walking around the ship and going below deck, which I urge you to do if you haven't, taught me an awful lot about the extraordinary nature of the ship that we're standing on here today. I mean, to begin with, of course, it's important that we realise, although we stand here looking back at a piece of history, in 1628, this ship was the most complicated and advanced machine that man had ever built. It was the height of high technology. And yet, of course, that did not mean it was a particularly comfortable place to spend 6 to 9 months of your life, and that's the length of time it took to travel from here all the way to Batavia in the East Indies. You have to bear in mind that there's, 200 of us here today. Well, you probably need to nearly double that to get to the number of people who were on board the ship when she actually sailed. There were about 340 people on board, all of whom were living very close together for a very long period of time. Much of it spent in very high temperatures for which they were very badly dressed because they were all wearing the sort of thick Dutch cloth of that day. And of course they were living in extremely insalubrious conditions. If you do have time to go around the ship, I urge you to go right forward to where the toilet arrangements are and find out what the rope that's standing down to the sea is actually used for. That will give you a good idea of the sort of conditions that people were actually living in then. Or find out a little bit more about the food that you were eating in those days, because of course the Batavia had to carry pretty much all of the food and drink that she was going to need for 340 people for 9 months on board when she left. And most of those people would have been living diets that we would find pretty unacceptable today. The mainstay would have been cask meat, which was heavily salted, the only way in which it could be preserved in those days. And of course there was no reservoir of high quality fresh water to cook the meat in. So normally what would happen is you would dunk a bucket down into the sea, bring up a load of brine, and then cook your cask beef in that, and it would come out so flaked with salt that it was almost inedible. That would be your the main source of your diet for the whole of that 9 months. And I find actually when I speak to people who've read the book that it's the conditions on board this ship that ring with them and stay with them as long as the horrors that actually happened to the people on board when they finally did wreck themselves off the coast of Australia. The bread which was eaten, which was so infested with insects that you had to tap it against the side of the ship before you could eat it, and all the maggots and the weevils and the worms would come scuttling out. The fact that a similar ship in the Danish East India Company, when the captain finally got driven mad by the cockroach plague on board, he offered a tot of brandy for every 1,000 cockroaches that his crew could kill. And by the time he'd finished, there were 37,000 dead cockroaches on the table next to him. That's a pretty good example of the sort of conditions you'd have on board the ship. But of course you'd be dealing on this ship with Hieronymus Cornelius himself, and that might have been quite an interesting occurrence. Hieronymus was an interesting person, and he tells us an awful lot about the history of the Netherlands in many ways. I mean, to begin with, of course, as far as we can tell, he was not a member of the mainstream of Dutch society at this time. He was a Mennonite, an Anabaptist, and he had certainly educated himself in ways that the majority of strict Dutch Calvinists would have been pretty shocked at, most obviously because when he came to live in Haarlem, which is where he was living when he finally joined the Batavia in 1628, he seems to have picked up some very revolutionary and unusual religious ideas there. Most obviously the idea which we now call antinomianism. Now, for those who don't know, and I didn't know before I started writing the book, antinomianism is the idea that you can, as a religious adept, become so closely identified with God that every belief, every idea that comes into your head was actually placed there by God. Now, if you're someone like Hieronymus Cornelius stranded on an island off the coast of Australia, that's a very convenient but rather dangerous belief for everybody else, of course, because it means that if you get the idea that you're in danger and it might be a good thing to thin out the ranks of the survivors a little and murder a few people, that isn't so much just an interesting idea, it's actually a command from God, and you better get on and do it. And that explains quite a lot of what happened on the Batavia. We also know, of course, that Hieronymus was a representative of the medical trinity, which was the people you would go to if you were ever ill in Holland in this period: the doctors, the apothecaries, and the surgeons. What you have to understand, of course, is that the medical knowledge in those days was not advanced to the point where it was actually a very good idea, certainly to go to a doctor. And in fact, until about 1850, you'd be more likely to recover if you didn't go to see a doctor than if you did. Doctors were very, very expensive people to go and see, nevertheless, and Hieronymus was a representative of the apothecaries, who were actually the people who treated 95% of all Dutchmen in this time. And they were the people who'd mix up the potions and herbal remedies that were actually what most people could afford. And when I did the research on this, I discovered some pretty alarming recipes that they were using. Most obviously, the theriac, which they used to brew up, which is the sort of cure-all that was most popular at that time, is mostly made from the flesh of dead vipers, which the apothecaries would have to keep and kill themselves in order to make. Now, Hieronymus, of course, found himself on the Batavia for the same reason as most of the people on board did. He was absolutely desperate. You had to be absolutely desperate to come on a ship like this and undertake the voyage that they were going to undertake, because only about one person every three would ever come back to the Netherlands alive. The remaining two-thirds would either die in the course of the voyage of some sort of disease or shipboard accident, or they would drink themselves to death or die of disease in the East Indies. And so the only people who would come on board the ship were those who had absolutely no choice, and there was a rich variety of those who make the characters who are actually in the book. Apart from Hieronymus, who had had his apothecary shop bankrupted as a result of a rather unsavoury disease that either he or his wife or his wet nurse had contracted, leading to the unfortunate death of his son and a scandal in Haarlem which drove him out of the city. There was also a lady by the name of Lucretia van der Meilen, who was the sort of femme fatale of the Batavia story. So during the course of the 9-month voyage, Lucretia, who we're told was a remarkable beauty by the standards of the day, was a target not only for Pelsart, who was the upper merchant in charge of the voyage, and also Arian Jacobs, who was the skipper of the ship, but also for Hieronymus himself, and she would be the cause of quite a lot of the tragedy which actually happened when the Batavia finally crashed into the coast of the Abrolhos Islands off the coast of Australia. I haven't really got time to tell you much about what happened on those islands, but fortunately by visiting this new exhibition you can get a pretty good feel for what it would have been like, and you don't need much imagination to realise that the people who were stranded on the Abrolhos were in a desperate situation. For a start, it was pretty unlikely they were ever going to be rescued. Secondly, they were on an island that was about 400 metres by 200 metres long and had no natural resources at all. And thirdly, of course, they were stranded there with Hieronymus Cornelius and a whole group of cutthroats. So essentially they were in a position where they were on an island with a psychopath who had all the weapons. And the story of what happened to them, as I say, I can't tell you now, but it certainly is worth pointing out that out of the people who were stranded on Batavia's graveyard with Hieronymus, only 20 people out of the 340 on the ship finally made it back to the Netherlands. So it's a story which really is rich in every sort of drama. And in closing, it's probably worth pointing out that it's also a story which hasn't entirely come to an end yet. And we found out a little bit more since the book was published, not just about Hieronymus and his family, but also about some of the other members of the crew, particularly Krisha Jans, the femme fatale. And I'm here today with a couple of friends, Henk Lowenstein and Hans Zelstra, who've helped me to research this. And it's worth just telling you a little bit about what we found about Lucretia just in the last year or so, because it does now emerge that when she finally made it back to Batavia in the Dutch East Indies, her story was by no means over. I remember that when the book was first published, and Paul Verhoeven, the Dutch filmmaker, bought the rights for a film that sadly never got made, he sent his scriptwriter to come and talk to me about it, and he said, you know, what I really want to do, I want to make Lucretia a sort of villain, I want to have her